all gacha game stories suck. Or do they? Story in video games has been a topic of debate for a while now, and depending on what kind of video game it is, people have different levels of quality for what they deem as acceptable. Just recently, there was a post on Denfami Nico Gamer which got a lot of attention talking about game story, story writing, and the industry behind how it got to the point where it is now. It has a lot of information on the behind-the-scenes workings of some of your favorite games like Fate Grand Order, Blue Archive, Genshin, HSR, and Uma Musume, among others. This post is written by two people. Shiwasu Toru, a light novel author who has also been in the game story writing industry for almost 20 years, working on games like Grand Blue Relink, for example, among many others that they can't disclose for reasons I'll explain later on in the video. And it's also co-written by Shimomura Ken, who is the COO of Qualia Writers Incorporated, one of the biggest story writing firms in the industry, and has worked on games such as Chain Chronicle with over 12 million downloads, as well as Onmyoji, which has over 200 million downloads. The thing is though, this is a follow-up to an article they wrote back in April of 2020, which is just as interesting and in-depth, so I decided to split this video up into two parts to cover each of these articles. So with that being said, let's get right into it. Games and their stories have had a long and intertwined history, almost as long as the game industry itself, yet even in the Japanese gaming industry, while game story writer was a recognized job title, it wasn't recognized as an actual legitimate profession for a long time. Since the 2010s, the game story writing industry has changed dramatically for the better, and three games were key to this transformation. Chain Chronicle. This game proved that mobile games with strong storylines could be successful. It also established a story structure that would continue to influence many future games even to this day. Grand Blue Fantasy. Like Chain Chronicle, this game's success was due to its focus on story. Crucially, it also created an unprecedented demand for in-house story writers within the game industry. Fate Grand Order. Now a blockbuster game that still rakes in anywhere between $15 million to $30 million every month on average, FGO amplified the trend set by the first two games, leading to an immense boom in the game story industry. Its impact was so significant that it altered the very specifications of many game stories and led to a surge in story production companies. This video will delve into the changes within the game story writing industry driven by these three influential titles. First of all, how are screenwriters selected for game development projects? Since the 1980s, game stories were typically written by whoever was available within the development company. Planners, directors, and other staff members frequently took on the role out of necessity. This approach led to inconsistent quality. While some games achieved masterpiece status, many others were often confusing or poorly written. This raises the question, why didn't companies just hire professional writers? There are two primary reasons for this historical trend. The first reason relates to the unique workflow of game development. In a typical game production cycle, the main story must be finalized early in the process. For example, in a one-year project, the story might be completed within the first 6 months. So if a specialized writer is hired solely for the story, they may have little work for the remainder of the development cycle, making a full-time position seem inefficient. The second reason stems from specific constraints of game projects. When large volume stories became necessary for RPGs, companies sometimes outsource writing to external professionals. However, these projects often face significant problems. For example, a story written by an anime scriptwriter might be well crafted but unsuitable for a game. External writers often fail to grasp game-specific limitations such as the technical constraints of older consoles or the challenges of rendering complex scenes within a game engine. These constraints, which are common across various industries, not just gaming, are typically understood only by those that are experienced in game development. Anime scripts have constraints that are specific to anime, and movie scripts have constraints that are specific to movies, etc., etc. And also, when outsourcing, copyright issues can arise. So, in the end, it is often more efficient to handle the issue in-house. The 1990s marked a turning point in game development with the rise of large-scale RPGs and adventure games, including those targeting more mature audiences. These genres demanded longer, more intricate storylines, making it increasingly difficult for planners and directors to handle story creation alongside their primary responsibilities. And so, outsourcing to external writers with specialized knowledge of game specifications and narrative rapidly grew, and some external writers were even brought in as temporary full-time staff. The 2000s saw a further surge in demand for game story, particularly in the emergence of games aimed at women and idol-themed games. This era led to the development of dedicated game story writers and specialized production companies. However, the compensation structure for these writers was often very challenging. They were typically paid by the character using a unit called a KB, which represents approximately 500 characters. The going rate for 1 KB ranged from either 500 yen all the way to 1,500 yen, which isn't that much. To make a living, many writers had to produce several dozen KBs daily. For example, Shiwasu, who wrote this article, began working as a game script writer around 2007, but said that they couldn't sustain themselves solely on game script writing until the mid-2010s. So they had to supplement their income by also working as a novelist. Outside of renowned writers associated with major blockbuster games, the ability to make a living solely as a professional game story writer was largely limited to a small fraction of individuals who were exceptionally fast writers or had no living expenses due to living with family or something. The year 2010 marked a major turning point for the gaming industry, ushering in the era of gaming on mobile devices with games such as Tanken Drilland, Dragon Collection, and Kaito Royale. And while these social games were popular, the game story was never given much importance due to unavoidable circumstances such as the issue of functionality. Games at the time were mainly browser-based and played on a type of mobile phone developed entirely in Japan called Galake, short for Galapagos Keitai or Galapagos cell phone. The term Galapagos here refers to how these phones evolved independently within the Japanese market. They were tailored to the Japanese consumer preferences and infrastructure using unique standards that were often incompatible with global standards. This made them incredibly popular and functional within Japan, but difficult to export or for foreign manufacturers to compete against inside of Japan. My wife still has her old Galake phones here. I've got 1, 2, and 3. These are incredibly old phones. This phone here actually ceased production back in 2008, and you can see actually some of the keys are falling out here. It's so old. But they had other sort of functionalities in there that were way ahead of their time, such as they had touch to pay, like electronic wallets, like Apple Pay or something. They had these way back in like 2005 or something like that time. Even now you can still buy Galake, even though they are a dying breed and being slowly phased out of use for more modern smartphones. But the point is though, their small screens, often around 3.4 inches, made it challenging to display elaborate graphics or incorporate sophisticated screen effects. Furthermore, their usability couldn't compare to the precise control offered by home consoles controllers such as for PlayStation or Nintendo. Some developers likely found it cumbersome to present lengthy stories requiring users to repeatedly tap on buttons to navigate small chunks of text on such limited screens. A term called a tap or click limit was also born in the development field. The tap limit referred to the idea that if the user has to tap the screen for more than 10 times in one cutscene to read the story, they will stop playing the game. Therefore, the amount of the story that can be devoted to one cutscene should be limited to 10 taps, which was based on the data at the time. Of course, some games put importance on the storyline, even on Galake. However, on average, there is no doubt that the games that were accepted by many users at the time were games like Kaito Royale that were suitable for Galake and that emphasize social communication between users. In fact, Kaito Royale is the reason why these games are referred to as soshage or social games in Japanese to this day. There are other games which played a part in this, of course, but Kaito Royale is probably the biggest cause. Kaito Royale was one of, if not the biggest mobile game in Japan at the time, raking in over $12 million every month, which might not sound like all that much now, with games making double or even triple that on average, but at the time it was a gigantic amount for a mobile game. It became so big it eventually got its own live-action TV drama series. However, the 3 years after 2010 saw the sudden rise of smartphones, and as a result, native apps for smartphones began to dominate the market. Unlike Galake, smartphones have larger screens and can display beautiful graphics. The freedom to explore more in terms of story direction improved dramatically, so it was only natural that games that placed importance on storytelling began to appear. One of the best games that represented the new focus is Chain Chronicle, released by Sega Networks, now Sega Games, in 2013. Chain Chronicle was not only highly praised for its storyline, but it is also known as the game that created the storyline structure for native apps. Chain Chronicle was also the first to implement large-scale events with storylines and endings, which are now commonplace. However, the most revolutionary aspect of this is that it created a new motivation for gacha. When talking about these social games, the first thing that comes to mind is the gacha. And when it comes to characters that can be obtained through gacha, many games push players to pull on the gacha by creating incentives such as stronger abilities, advantages in events, and more eye-catching graphics. However, Chain Chronicle had the unique feature that by obtaining a character through gacha, you could view a story exclusive to that character known as a character quest. In other words, through longer stories, the game developers were able to make users connect more with those characters, creating a new motivation for users to pull for those characters that didn't really exist up to that point. Now, gacha games were already out by this time. It was difficult to go anywhere without seeing people play either Puzzles and Dragons or Monster Strike. They had the gameplay, they had the characters, they had the gacha, but they didn't have much, if anything, in terms of story. Not the case with Chain Chronicle. Not only was the game fun, but the characters were also appealing, drawing users in. This story structure has also influenced many games including Fate Grand Order, which will be discussed later on in the video. Since the smartphone boom, various companies have been releasing games that emphasize storylines, but the success of Chain Chronicle seemed to have further boosted this trend. In fact, from this point, many game proposals began to include the phrase, "We aim to create a storyline like Chain Chronicle." Next, we move on to Granblue Fantasy from developer Cygames, which was a big hit around the same time and influenced many other games. The game, which was released in the spring of 2014, has had a huge impact on the gaming industry. In particular, the impact of the game being a huge hit as a game that places great importance on the storyline is comparable to that of Chain Chronicle. However, from the perspective of game story writers, Granblue's greatest achievement is that it created a trend of hiring game story writers as permanent full-time employees. As mentioned at the beginning, the stories for many games released for consumer platforms were often written by planners or outsourced to freelance writers or story production companies. For example, many of the stories for Chain Chronicle were written by the freelance writing group Qualia, now Qualia Writers Inc. However, for native apps that place importance on the story, continuous delivery of stories is essential, not only during the development stage, but also after the service starts, such as event quests that are delivered almost monthly. In some cases, there may not be time to outsource, so to prepare for such situations, and above all, to accumulate know-how in story production within the company, it may be more convenient to produce these stories in-house rather than outsource. In other words, with the advent of native apps easily downloadable directly to users' phones that place more emphasis on the story, game development companies began to see a reason and a benefit in hiring game story writers as full-time employees. And the company that was the first in the history of the game industry to actively and large-scale employ story writers as employees was Cygames, the company behind Granblue Fantasy. To avoid any misunderstanding, this is not to say that Cygames was the first in the history of the game industry to employ in-house story writers, just that they were the first to employ so many at such a scale. Also, it's impossible to know exactly how much of Granblue Fantasy's success was due to Cygames employing so many in-house story writers either. However, from the perspective of the game story industry, there are two important points to note that definitely did happen. The first is that Cygames, which rose to fame with the hit game Granblue Fantasy placing an importance on the story, began to actively hire in-house story writers. And the second is that other game development companies saw this and began to follow suit and recruit in-house story writers with equal or even better conditions. We Aim to Create Stories Like Chain Chronicle eventually became We Aim to Create Stories Like Granblue. Because of these two factors, the competition to acquire talent became even fiercer and the number of professional screenwriters increased rapidly. However, the real momentum will not be known until the release of a certain game that will become a huge hit at the end of 2016, Fate Grand Order, aka FGO. Regardless of your personal opinion of Fate Grand Order, its launch created a monumental impact in the gaming world that continues to resonate to today. While many factors contributed to its popularity, this video was focused specifically on its storyline. FGO captivated players with its epic plot. The world is incinerated, the surviving protagonist journey through 7 pivotal historical eras to restore humanity's proper order. This expansive narrative, rich lore, and the dynamic interactions among its unique and varied characters garnered a massive fanbase. The immense success of FGO had an immeasurable impact on the game story industry. One of its most significant achievements was the relaxation of the tap limit in game narratives. Around 2010, the functional limitations of early Gacha phones led to game stories being treated as an afterthought. This gave rise to the tap count limit, as mentioned before, which was a convention based on player habits at the time. Despite the shift from Gacha phones to more capable smartphones, many development teams still adhered to the unwritten rule that a story should be limited to 10 or 20 taps. For story writers, this custom felt like a curse because 20 taps is incredibly limiting. It barely allowed enough space to explain the situation and the next mission, forcing character dialogue to be cut to an absolute minimum. Hiwasu clarifies here. To be clear, a longer story isn't automatically a better one. There have been instances where dialogue becomes excessively wordy when writers are given too much freedom, so some limits are necessary. Also, since many game stories are paid per KB, budgetary constraints often make limits essential. Depending on the game's concept, a more concise story, perhaps around 10 taps, can certainly be more effective. However, even if the story is a selling point, if the number of taps for all the stories is rigidly fixed, it will inevitably lead to issues. A story always has its ups and downs, and there are parts that should be devoted to lines and parts that shouldn't. Also, from the perspective of how easy it is to get into a game, it would be necessary to make some effort, such as making a shorter, more concise story in the beginning and longer in the latter half when the characters have already been well established. This curse-like tradition of tap limits has remained deeply rooted in the industry. As an example, Shirasu says this: "While playing a certain hit smartphone game whose selling point was the storyline, I thought the pacing of the storyline was bad, so I counted the number of taps and found that most of the storyline text was exactly 20 taps long." I'm not sure exactly which game he's referring to. Maybe someone out there has an idea and can leave their suspicions in the comment section below. He goes on to say that whenever he was asked to write a game story, the specifications almost always specified the number of taps, and that he once had a headache when asked to write a story that was both grand but had a specification of up to 20 taps per scene. The official statement is that the job of a story writer is to create something better than the best possible within the given specifications, but even so, there are limits. This tap limit also had an impact on FGO. There's a famous meme in FGO called "I'm in the middle of talking, but there's a wyvern," which is a semi-self-deprecating official joke about how characters are talking about something and then out of nowhere a battle happens for reasons. This is not limited to FGO, but most smartphone games at the time were structured so that each scene progressed with a story battle structure. Once the story had progressed to a certain extent, that is, once the number of taps had reached its arbitrary limit, it was common for the game to forcefully enter a battle, even at the expense of narrative consistency. FGO was no exception in the early days of its service launch, and as the story progressed, it would often transition into combat without any context, with messages like, "We're in the middle of talking, but a wyvern is attacking. Everyone do your best to defeat it." Details of this is also written in the official blog Bamboo Broom Diary by FGO main writer Nasu. When FGO first launched, it followed the conventions of mobile games at the time, such as you have to have a fight once every 3 minutes while playing. However, according to Nasu, after releasing the first 4 episodes for FGO, it was decided that more emphasis could be placed on the storyline. The 6th chapter of FGO was then produced and is known to have a fantastic storyline. It was so well received that it was even made into a movie, which is said to have contributed greatly to the explosive popularity of FGO at the end of 2016. I personally have played the game. I have over 2,000 login days in FGO, and I'm near day 1, but not exactly day 1 player, and I can say for sure that Chapter 6 was very, very good. But in terms of this conversation about tap limits, the number of taps in one scene of the story even exceeded 100 without any battles. It showed that no matter how many taps a story has, it can be accepted if it is interesting and engaging. The number of taps required for a single cutscene increased in many games in the following years. Even games that strictly kept to the 20-tap rule had clearly relaxed their limit after FGO blew up. Although we're talking about averages, the range of what can be expressed in a story has increased dramatically as a direct result of the huge success of FGO. The influence of FGO is not limited to what I've mentioned so far. 2017 was also the year when the phrase "we aim to create a story like Grand Blue Fantasy" then further evolved to become "we aim to create a story like FGO" and appeared in many game proposals. What happened as a result of the 4th dramatic change in the game story industry? A sharp increase in demand for game stories. The talent war that began with Grand Blue Fantasy intensified with FGO. Job postings surged as if they were competing for a scarce number of story writers. Shirasu mentions that it was the year that they received the most requests as a freelance writer. At the time, if you searched for game story writer job openings, you would find a lot of results listing annual salary of 3 million up to 10 million yen, benefits included. Some people may be wondering if everyone was actually being hired for 3 million yen, but the fact is that there were many people in the industry who were making around 7 to 8 million yen per year. 2017 was the year that the number of full-time game story writers who could make a living just by writing game stories saw their biggest surge. While the demand for stories has increased significantly, other changes have also begun to occur. There's an interesting difference between the 3 games mentioned so far: Chain Chronicle, Grand Blue Fantasy, and Fate Grand Order. Most of the stories for Chain Chronicle were written by Qualia Writers Inc., while Grand Blue Fantasy was written by Cygames in-house story writers, and most of the stories for Fate Grand Order were written by freelance writers. However, after the huge success of FGO, the number of stories required for a single game increased sharply. To deal with this, increasing the number of writers or increasing the amount of orders to writers would have been enough, but the story writing industry at the time was already short of manpower. It was difficult to find a writer suitable for one's own project, and if the amount of orders increased, the work of managing the writer's schedules and directing the deliverables would also increase proportionately. It's one thing if a game company has knowledge about ordering game stories, but building a story team from scratch is extremely difficult. Gradually, companies began to sign fewer contracts for in-house writers, and they increasingly outsourced some or all of the story work, finding writers, schedule management, story direction, etc., to story production companies instead. As a result, the following changes happened in the game story industry. As 2017 ended, freelance game writers began facing new challenges. Game companies increasingly outsourced work to specialized story writing firms, inevitably leading to fewer opportunities for individual, independent freelancers. This shift limited what freelancers could achieve on their own. For example, Shuasu recalled losing a freelance request during this period because the game developer decided to go with a story writing company instead. Freelancers faced several other difficulties. Difficulty approaching multiple companies individually, challenges in negotiating fees as they often lacked insider knowledge for industry rates, leaving them little to no choice but to accept limited offer amounts, navigating complex and lengthy contracts and non-disclosure agreements, and managing administrative tasks like sending invoices. Another significant issue was work history confidentiality. Game story writers often couldn't publicly announce the games that they'd worked on. The primary reason for this is player immersion. If a writer publicly claimed, "I wrote the story for this character," especially in a game like an idle game, for example, that writer's face might pop into the player's mind while playing, potentially breaking the immersion and enjoyment. Consequently, individual scriptwriters' track records often remained confidential, only shared privately, like on a resume where confidentiality is guaranteed. However, interestingly, some companies allowed writers to publicize their work if listed under a scriptwriting company rather than as themselves as a private individual. To address these problems, many writers began forming story production groups. This marked another major transformation in the game story industry, the boom in story production companies. By accepting scriptwriting projects as a group rather than as individuals, writers gained several advantages. They were freed from many cumbersome administrative procedures, compensation negotiations became smoother, and it became easier to find replacements if a writer faced an unexpected situation that prevented them from continuing a script. A prime example of this is Qualia, the company that wrote the story for Chain Chronicle. The company was originally a production group made of freelance writers. However, as their business increased, including overseas work, they incorporated and became Qualia Writers Inc. in 2017. Due to such success stories, story production companies have been appearing one after another. I'm saying story production companies as a catch-all, but there are various other types of companies, such as limited liability companies and public companies, and also companies that employ writers and companies that introduce writers with whom they have partnership agreements. You might be wondering exactly how many companies are there in this industry, which is a difficult question to answer as some teams only accept projects from specific companies, so there are some that don't even have a website at all, let alone disclose the names of their companies, making it impossible to say. Even those in the industry don't exactly know. As of 2020, the number of story production companies has seen a rapid increase, and they were all beginning to engage in fierce competition, saying, "If you leave it to us, we'll provide you with higher quality stories." There are probably many gamers out there who have played a classic game and thought, "I want to write a story like that," which was a dream that was very difficult to achieve in the early 2010s. However, thanks to the influence of great games such as Chain Chronicle, Granblue Fantasy, and FGO, the environment surrounding the game story industry has improved significantly to the point that it is now possible to choose to become a game story writer as a future career. But she also wants to make clear that they have no intention of saying that they want more emphasis to be placed on game stories. They say, "On the contrary, I often think that since FGO, game stories have been given more importance than necessary. Many projects have failed by misunderstanding the essence of the game, merely by claiming to aim for a story like FGO. Games are made by a team of many creators. Programming, graphics, sound, level design, project management, advertising, etc. None of these elements can be overlooked, and they should all be organically connected and interwoven together." This trend of recognizing game storylines as an appealing point to gamers is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Now, the world of game stories has entered a new era of fierce competition among story writing companies. Many story writers fear that this trend would soon lead to the bubble bursting. In fact, even back in 2020, there were signs of this, where some companies were saying that they had asked a story writing company to do the work, but the quality was poor, so they ended up doing it themselves. And then, in 2020, a global pandemic arrived that would change the industry in ways nobody could have imagined. That's it for part 1. If you want to check out part 2, then you can click here to see how things have changed since 2020. And also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe because that greatly supports the channel. So until next time, I will see you in the next video. Peace.